Hi, thanks for joining me for this painting a portrait in oils using non-traditional tools and methods that I've explored over a number of years. We're going to be exploring all sorts of different tools that I've come accustomed to using and I've been asked about over the 20 plus years of working professionally, like the brayer that I'm using right here, and squeegee, and some brushes, and paper towel, and fingers, and so on and so forth. The brayer that I'm using here is, I believe, a 1.5 inch or maybe a 1 inch. I've got them in all sorts of different sizes. I'm looking for a smaller one in case someone knows where to find it. Comment down below, please, and help me out. But I think the goal for this work, and every work really that I do, is to create a certain level of spontaneity. It isn't a gimmick. These tools are designed for all sorts of different things, but ultimately our goal is to create a work that it doesn't feel formulaic. I should tell you that I'm not really tech savvy. I apologize. You'll see in a moment here that my camera, which is actually expensive, is focusing on my shoulder and neck. And there's a larger faux pas later on in the video. We'll get to that later on. It's somewhat embarrassing, but again, I am sorry for that. At this initial stage, I'm mostly concerned about the large masses of dark and light. I am using obviously a monochrome palette. I'm using just raw umber, ivory black, and titanium white. I'll speak more on the equipment as we go along, but I'm not too concerned about colors here, so values are very important, and I am drawing with basically every brush stroke or a brayer or a brush or whatever to establish a likeness. Ultimately, I'm trying to get this to look like the reference. I'm working off of a photo in this case. You'll notice as we go along that the process really, when you boil it down, entails constructing and deconstructing to achieve a likeness, painting and then removing paint, like you just noticed with that brush, and you're seeing now here with the paper towel. You apply paint, you scumble paint on, you remove the paint, and that kind of retains that level of playfulness and spontaneity. Just when you think you've got something completely done, you remove it, or certainly good parts of it, and that kind of keeps things interesting. Here I'm continuing to draw, of course, with the brush, adding and removing paint. I'm now using a brayer again, and in this case, exactly what I mentioned. When I'm removing paint, the brayer is clean of any paint. I've used it earlier, obviously, for the blocking stage to add paint layers on, but in this case, it's being used to remove layers and to reveal some of the under layers. For this particular portrait, I've chosen to work with water-soluble oils. I tend to gravitate towards them for obvious non-toxicity reasons. I have a smaller studio and kids at home, and for obvious reasons, I use oils that are water-based. Don't ask me about the chemistry, but they do have a similar characteristic as traditional oils. They are somewhat gummier. I tend to work with cobras, which are, I think, closest to traditional oils that I also sometimes employ. Here I am again using that brayer for drawing. And by nature, really, the brayer leaves somewhat of a hard edge. And I'm knocking it back somewhat here, as you can see, with a paper towel underneath. You want it to keep it relatively loose at this stage of the painting and reserve the hard edges for the end. As you can see there, I've just described that process from before where you spatter some water on there and then remove it. Brayer is very unique in that sense. You roll it over and it reveals some of the underlayers underneath. Now the reason I've done that, on that side we obviously have the light coming in and the beard is going to be lit up. As I said, only working with a chromatic palette here, so it's important to keep as little of paint and have the base white underlayer to indicate light coming in from that side. And at the same time, every time I do this, the results are spontaneous. You don't know how the water is going to flow and where it's going to drip, and it adds interest. Speaking of the substrate, I am working on a gator board. So I've written a bit about this. There's a blog post on my site. I'll leave a link down below. But essentially it's a wooden veneer that's sandwiched between a polyurethane or styrofoam type center. The substrate is quite light and very rigid, and I've been told that it'll retain that rigidity over time. You can certainly paint directly on that or glue a muslin or linen canvas on it. In this case, what I've done is applied a few layers of gesso, acrylic gesso, sanded it down, and painted directly on that. And it's important to have that, a substrate that's relatively smooth, so that you can do things like I'm doing here, where you apply a roller and you remove paint. I could basically, you'll see this later on, remove this down to the white substrate relatively quickly with a paper towel or a squeegee. Now you can see here I'm using a paper towel again to knock back some of those edges. In the shadow, I want that to blend to the background. I don't want it to show as much, and at the same time adding interest. And here you see again I am redrawing that ear. It's been lost. It may appear again a few times, it may disappear again, but that whole process of adding and removing is what gives this work, and any work really, that interest and a unique factor. Here I'm using the brayer again to give depth, more depth really, to the darker side of the beard, of course, and the background. I have a general idea as to where I want this portrait to go, and I think that's the most important concept to sort of keep in mind when you're painting portraits, landscapes, really any type of artwork. As you know, you have a general idea as to where you want to go, and then there's always surprises. And here you can see again, I'm drawing, I'm redrawing, I'm taking away. As I said earlier, I'm trying to get a likeness. So it's important not to deviate too much from the sitter, or in this case, a photo reference that I'm working off of. Here for the first time I'm introducing a 2-inch brush to knock back some of the edges further, and at the same time add interest. The brush will obviously have different texture, different look when applied as opposed to a brayer or a smaller brush. Here for the first time I'm using a tool that I use quite often. It's called a catalyst. It's essentially just a rubber squeegee that has multiple sides that you can work with. And I'm again removing paint. And I'm adding interest or removing paint in the mustache, around the nose, certainly a lot of the highlights. A lot of times it doesn't go how I like. Lines are produced, it leaves certain residue. You knock it back, you add more, you remove more, but that really is what adds interest that I talked about earlier. Here that exact squeegee is used to build some indication of a beard or remove paint to indicate beard on the light side of the face and the hair. Paper towel as well is being used for that purpose. I will be building up lighter layers. I wasn't sure at this stage whether to do that or not, but I ended up doing it with titanium white. But I'm trying to get this as close to actual color values of the reference as I can. So ultimately I am using paint, but it's a drawing more than anything else. I'm focused constantly on the reference and I'm comparing to see where the lights are, darks are, how they relate to one another. Values are, as I said, very important throughout the painting process. What's not evident in this video, the sped up video, is that I often step back from the canvas. This is just a practice that I've done for as long as I can recall. I paint standing up, I rarely sit, and I step back and you can evaluate colors differently. There's a mirror as well in my studio that I can look at the painting in, and it gives you a fresh perspective as to what might be off. Maybe the eye's not in the right alignment, maybe the nose is too short, and so on and so forth. Another thing that we haven't talked about yet, but is quite important, is the process of squinting. So when you're looking at your model or a photo like I'm using in this case, I'm squinting. I'm not focusing on the details when I paint at this point. I'm squinting, I'm looking at the larger planes and applying those. I'm kind of trying to work in the midtones as long as possible. As we saw, I am applying darker values as well, but I'm not too focused on details. And in fact, that's another reason why using the tools that I do use forces me to paint broader as opposed to specific. Even the brush that I was using earlier and that I'll use later on, I use in a horizontal manner to more crumble paint on as opposed to filling in a plane of an eye or lips and so on. Here you can see me using another secret that I employ. My fingernails along with a paper towel, although you can't see it there with my arm obscuring. I just removed a bit from the ear, using my fingernails to give texture as well as interest to the overall portrait. This particular portrait was painted over a couple-day period, 1-2 day really. It's supposed to have been an alla prima, or just one day sort of study. But what had happened was I ended up achieving much more of a realistic likeness that I waited for it to dry and apply final touches, which we'll see at the end. For this particular part, I don't know what had happened, but I think the canvas was shifted, and you can see on the side better than before where the drip marks are on the beard and the side of the face. And some of the ones, if you recall, on the side of his beard, which were basically white, are now kind of blended in as we worked along with the brush really, and mostly the paper towel, which blends everything down. At this point of the painting, we've laid down the foundation and we've established interest really with all of the layers we've applied and removed. And now I'm mostly just focusing on, if you want to call it rendering, but certainly attaining a likeness using this half-inch brush that I'm holding really as you would a comb, for example, and not a pencil. The likeness I'm trying to achieve here is of one John Ilyich Sergeyev, also known as Saint John of Kronstadt, a well-known Christian saint who lived in the 19th century. He was born in 1829. It's quite a life he lived. I'll leave a link down below if anyone wants to read up on him, but it was filled with a whole lot of miracles and charitable work. Quite a pious man he was. At this stage, as you can see, I am introducing this 1/8 inch brush to add more interest really to the light part of his face. I wasn't sure that I was going to do this. Initially I thought I was going to do a monochromatic study in raw umber and ivory black, with the substrate being the lightest light, but ultimately I decided with adding titanium white for the highlights, and ended up coming out okay. Sometimes I do this mid-painting, you take a certain direction where you don't anticipate, and it doesn't always work out, but I was quite happy with this result. You'll notice that even though I'm using this small brush, what I would consider a small brush for me, I'm not really filling sections in. I am, again, scumbling paint on, rarely filling anything in, going over edges, knocking them back. And one key to this is holding the brush loosely in your fingers, not pressing down too much on the handle, applying and then removing. In retrospect, I wish I had rendered his eyes more closer to completion at this stage. Now that I see this, I like the playfulness and the brushwork all really around his face, the beard and everything else. And instead of focusing on the highlights, I wish I'd paid more attention to the eyes now, because really, in any portrait, they are the focal point. The reason is that if you put down or complete a reference point in a painting, whether that, in my case, a black and white portrait being the eyes, or if there was color involved, maybe the color key of some kind that's a standout that sort of grabs your attention initially. So if you do these things before you move on, everything else will sort of play off of that, and you'll have a better idea as to when the painting's completed. For me, in this case, if I had, as I said, rendered the eye to completion, maybe everything else would have sort of gelled and not require all this much work in the highlights. But you never know when you're painting how these things sort of play out. here I'm back at with the half-inch brush, really lightly dragging titanium white. I believe this is pure titanium white, maybe just a slight dab of ivory and raw umber. I'm sort of scumbling it, or I'm dragging it across the surface. I don't want it to be applied too thickly. I want to give indication of light, but at the same time I want it to sort of flow on the surface and to indicate that some of the other layers we've already applied earlier. Another key to keeping things looking loose, as you can see, for example, I've got this half-inch brush that I'm applying highlights to, but I try to apply it not in an exact plane. So as you can see there over that left eye, there's a dab of white in there. I'm putting in darker tones, and I'm not only going there, you'll see in a moment that I try to see if I can extend the plane of that particular whatever it is that I'm painting, hair or eye. And for example, right there you got some of the dark that goes across the brow up onto the forehead. I like those spontaneous feels. This is the part that I mentioned earlier where you can see quite a deviation from the previous image. What had happened was I lost about half an hour to 45 minutes of footage because it was out of focus. And again, as I said earlier, I apologize. I am sometimes juggling, trying to record things and moving around the tripod. Maybe somebody can help me down below to give me an idea of equipment. I mean, I'm finding it somewhat difficult. Maybe I have to get used to this. Recording, painting, stepping back, not tripping on the tripod and so forth. But what you notice now, obviously the face is much more polished. In the half hour that we lost, I basically just sort of loosened or tightened up, I should say, a lot of the edges of his face. Here for the first time we are introducing a fan brush, a favorite of mine. I've got these guys in quite a number of different sizes. This is, I believe, an inch brush, and again, it's something that I use even in the initial stage of painting, just because it's unpredictable with the kind of marks that it makes and the shapes that it creates. The one downside to it being used for an underpainting is that it doesn't hold that much paint and you have to reapply. Brayer doesn't either, but you can kind of reapply and apply quicker with it as opposed to a fan brush. In this case, I've got a 1 inch and I believe this is a half-inch fan brush that's basically going over the darks and lights and reintroducing some edges that were lost. As I said, the face is much more polished and true to life, how he really looked from the previous looser stage. In this final phase of the work, where most of the rendering is completed, I reserve it for the highest highs and lowest lows, really. So you're reintroducing some edges, as I said. We're adding high key colors, so that in this case titanium white, pure titanium white, to the nose, the brow, under the eye, the forehead. As you can see, I'm knocking it back with my finger. Sometimes the finger is the tool of choice and it does better than anything else. And that's really what I wanted to communicate with this video. You know, using different tools for different needs to get the desired result. I apologize again for the poor lighting in this shot. I promise I'll get it right for the next video, I hope. But in this final phase, I kind of broke my own rule, and I did use a tip brush to put in the final highlight in his eyes. I felt it was needed, and some more brushwork around the eye just to sort of put in the final highlights. And as you can see here, I have taken the camera off the tripod so you can see it up close. In the end, I'm quite happy with the rendered finished work. I don't normally go to this length, but I felt it was needed to represent this great man. I plan on doing many more of these types of videos, hopefully with no technical issues, so please do subscribe, and we'll get it right eventually. Thank you for watching.